Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
Are you ready for a shocking truth? What if I told you the person my family spent years celebrating was never the hero at all, just the loudest storyteller in the room, and that everything unraveled the night I was told to keep my mouth shut? That dinner was supposed to be my brother's victory parade, the kind of staged event my mother lives for, with the right wine on the table, the right faces in the seats, and just enough false cheer to make sure everyone believes we are the perfect family. Before the meal even began, my mother leaned toward me, her hand on my arm like it was an act of tenderness, and whispered that I should not mention anything about my own life that evening because, in her words, this is his night, let him shine. I knew she meant it as an order, not a request, and I nodded, partly because it was easier than starting an argument in front of extended family, and partly because I was tired of being the one accused of ruining things when all I ever did was exist with my own successes. So I swallowed it. I kept my news to myself. I thought maybe it was better to let him have this fake stage, because if he needed that much applause to feel whole, maybe it was worth just letting him have it. I sat there with my glass, listening to everyone praise him for his so-called promotion, a role he had been talking up for months, even though I knew something about the story felt strange. He had no paperwork to show, no official title change, and every time I asked a simple question, like what his responsibilities actually were, he gave me these vague speeches that sounded like they had been rehearsed in the mirror. I wanted to call it out, but I stayed quiet, like I always did, because in my family silence was considered love, while truth was considered betrayal. But then Victor, his boss, a man I had never seen outside of a work setting, raised his glass for a toast, and instead of congratulating him the way everyone expected, he gave this little pause, the kind that makes your stomach drop before the words even come. And then he said, "Funny thing, since Tyler has been lying to all of you." You could feel the entire table seize up, forks in midair, glasses half lifted, everyone frozen as if sound had been cut off. My mother's face drained, my father looked like he wanted to crawl under the table, and my brother went pale in a way I had not seen since we were kids, and he got caught stealing. And here is the part that mattered. I did not rush to defend him, I did not smooth over the silence, and I did not redirect the conversation. I kept my promise to stay quiet about my own news, but instead of rescuing him, I just looked directly at Victor and asked, calmly, "Would you rather we talk about this privately, or would you prefer to keep the table honest?" The words came out steady, not sharp, but they landed in a way that shifted the power instantly, because suddenly it was not my brother holding the spotlight, it was his boss, and he had no script prepared for that. Victor set his glass down, pushed his chair back, and said, "Privately now." The sound of chairs moving, silverware clinking, and my mother hissing under her breath was almost comical, but no one laughed, because the moment was too heavy. We stood up, and I followed them out into the lobby, the weight of every eye burning into my back, and for once I did not feel small or silenced. I just felt like I was standing exactly where I had always been headed. As we walked out, my mother gripped my arm hard enough to hurt and whispered that if I loved my brother, I would fix this the way I always did. I looked at her, then at him, and I thought about every single time I had been told to sit down so he could stand taller, every award he took credit for, every story he inflated while I bit my tongue. And in that moment, I decided this time I would not fix anything. I would not lie, I would not sign, I would not smooth it over. He was finally standing in the mess he created, and I was not going to be the one to mop it up. The lobby doors closed behind us and the air felt sharp, but my voice stayed calm as I repeated the question. Did Victor want this to stay between us, or did he want everyone to hear the truth? He gave a small nod and said, "We will handle this here." My brother opened his mouth to spin some excuse, but before he could, Victor looked at me and asked, "You have seen the numbers too, haven't you?" And my silence became heavier than anything I could have said, because the truth was already moving forward, whether I chose to speak or not. That was the start of it, the night I realized that staying quiet can sometimes be louder than shouting. And what happened in that lobby was only the beginning. By the time the lobby doors sighed shut behind us and the distant clatter of plates faded into something like static, Victor had already settled into the kind of measured calm that people use when they are about to say something that cannot be unsaid. And he looked at my brother with a restraint that felt almost generous before he turned to me and, with the straightforwardness of someone who has chosen facts over theater, asked whether I had seen the numbers as they actually lived inside the system rather than as they were dressed up on the screenshots that kept making their way into family group chats, quarterly decks, and my mother's rehearsed anecdotes about her brilliant son who always outperformed his peers. I told him I had, and I did not need to raise my voice or add any dramatic emphasis, because the truth, when it is simple and well documented, does not require volume. It only requires oxygen. Months earlier, through an outside firm that had me on a fixed-term engagement unrelated to anything that reported to my brother, I had been brought in to map an attribution leak that was costing the company real money. And although the mandate never named individuals and the deliverable was a process audit rather than a personnel report, the breadcrumb trail of mismatched fields, backdated entries, and renewals mislabeled as new business kept leading to the same user permissions, the same timestamps conveniently missing seconds, and the same pattern of cropping that cut the columns just short of where the story turned into evidence. Victor listened without interruption and then, with a kind of weary gratitude that people in his position rarely show in front of family, said that the external auditors had already received a package matching the description I gave, which told me that the adults in the room were in fact doing their jobs and that my presence here was not about being a witness for the prosecution, but about drawing a boundary with a family that had grown used to mistaking my quiet competence for a limitless cleanup service. I nodded, because I understood that the cleanest move I could make was to step back and let the system complete the loop I had already helped initiate, and the small piece of satisfaction I felt did not come from seeing my brother cornered, but from finally refusing to be the person who creates a path out of the consequences he earned. My mother tried to slide between us with the gentle-voiced urgency of someone who thinks a calm tone can turn a legal issue into a misunderstanding, asking whether I might write a clarifying note that would make it all go away. Something about the spreadsheets being a collaborative effort, something about best intentions, something that sounded harmless until you pictured your signature next to a statement that a company lawyer would later read out loud while asking pointed questions about who changed which field and when. I told her I would not sign anything, not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because words on paper mean something, and because I had finally accepted that love without accountability is just a loyalty test that never ends. Tyler, who had been quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar, leaned close enough that only I could hear him and said that if I truly loved him I would fix the data like before, and if I refused then he would tell everyone about my little side deal. A phrase he threw out like a grenade even though he did not seem to know the shape of it, and I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because in his world the mere suggestion of impropriety is supposed to send me scrambling to defend myself, so I looked him in the eye and asked, as calmly as I could, which one he meant. The conflict of interest clause I had already disclosed to his company's legal team before I ever touched their systems. The firewall between my contract and his department that I insisted on in writing, or the ethics briefing I recorded for Human Resources 2 weeks ago that made it impossible for me to be anyone's secret weapon ever again. Victor cleared his throat and, choosing to end the family theater, said the next steps were procedural and not personal, that a suspension would be issued pending formal review, that access would be limited while logs were retrieved, and that further conversation would happen with counsel present, which was his way of reminding us that the hallway we were standing in was not a confessional, and that the safest thing for everyone, including my brother, was to let the process work. I thanked him for the clarity, and then I did the only thing that qualified as a small and deeply satisfying revenge for me, which was to decline every invitation, spoken or implied, to soften what was happening with an apology or a friendly spin, and instead point him quietly to the version folder where the auditors could find the exact workflow I had recommended, the same one that would make this kind of manipulation much harder for anyone to repeat. We returned to the table because my mother insisted that appearances mattered and because my father, bless him, still believed a meal could be salvaged, yet the room had already shifted. And the faces that had been so quick to cheer minutes earlier were now studying their napkins as though linen could give them instructions. My brother leaned in again, his voice tight and brittle, and said that if he went down then I would go down with him, and I told him, not as a threat but as a simple statement of fact, that he should read the metadata on his spreadsheets before making promises his files could not keep, because the days when my silence would protect him had ended the moment he tried to weaponize it. And as the server asked whether anyone wanted dessert, and my mother shook her head so hard the question died midair, I realized that the story my family had practiced for years, the one where I am the reliable understudy who fixes the show, had finally been retired, not with a speech or a public shaming, but with a handful of well-documented truths placed in the right hands at the right time. And, while that might not sound dramatic enough for a movie, it was more than enough for me, because sometimes the smartest way to win is to stop playing the role that keeps everyone else from meeting the consequences they worked so hard to avoid. The suspension call came faster than I expected, and when Victor's voice broke the hum of my phone, it carried that mix of politeness and steel that only surfaces when someone is reading a script written by lawyers. Yet, still trying to sound as though this is just a small bump rather than the kind of pivot that permanently changes how a person is seen inside a company. And he explained that pending investigation my brother would be placed on leave with system access restricted, which in plain language meant they were freezing him out while they sorted through the paper trail. I thanked him for letting me know, even though technically I was not supposed to be in the loop. And when I hung up, I was staring at the family group chat already lighting up with my mother's frantic questions and my father's weak attempts to calm her down, both of them acting as though this was a misunderstanding that could be patched over with an apology and maybe a note written by me if I would just agree to lend my credibility to Tyler's mess once again. The irony was not lost on me that the very thing my mother wanted me to sign, a so-called clarifying note meant to protect Tyler's reputation, would have done nothing but tie my name directly to falsified reports, leaving me vulnerable to the same scrutiny he deservedly faced. And I found myself thinking about how many times in childhood I had been nudged to take the fall for something small: broken dishes, missing cash from my father's wallet, dented furniture. Because in my mother's mind, keeping Tyler spotless was more important than fairness, and I realized that nothing had changed except the scale of the stakes, because now instead of covering for a lie about chores, I was being asked to shield a man from legal liability. And the expectation carried the same tone of inevitability, as though family loyalty was a contract I had signed at birth. When Tyler stormed into the parking lot later that night, red-faced and vibrating with a kind of rage that seemed less about fear of losing his job and more about fear of losing the narrative he had built for himself, he leaned across the hood of my car and hissed that if he went down then I would go down with him, because he had already told people I was involved in preparing his numbers, and although I knew this was bluster, I also knew he was reckless enough to repeat it until someone decided to treat it as fact, so I simply told him that before making declarations he should look at the metadata on his spreadsheets, because it would reveal who touched which file and at what time, and unlike him I had never needed to backdate a single thing, never needed to crop out a column, never needed to fake a credential. The truth, though, was that I had news he did not yet know, and the reason I had been so careful with every move was because months earlier I had accepted a long-term compliance lead role at a firm outside of his orbit, one with strict conflict of interest clauses that forbade side favors and family entanglements, meaning that even if I had wanted to rescue him, which I did not, I was legally barred from doing so. And that layer of protection was not only contractual, but also psychological, because for the first time in my life I had a written excuse to say no without being accused of cruelty or selfishness, and I cannot describe the relief that came with finally having a boundary so firm that even my mother's pleas could not bulldoze it. That night she called me again, her voice trembling with that brittle mix of anger and fear, saying she could not understand how I could be so cold, how I could sit back and watch my brother unravel when all it would take was a single paragraph from me to calm things down. And I told her slowly, clearly, with no wiggle room, that words on paper mattered more than she seemed to realize. Because once you put your name next to a falsehood, you are not just smoothing something over, you are participating in it, and I was not willing to give away my future to keep Tyler's story alive, Not anymore. Not after years of cleaning his messes while being told to stay silent about my own accomplishments so his ego could have room to breathe. In that moment, my revenge was not loud, it was not theatrical, it was not even personal, it was structural, because instead of writing what she wanted, I drafted a simple one-page explainer about why signatures matter. Phrased in plain language that even someone without a legal background could understand, and I sent it to the family group chat so that no one could pretend later they did not know what they were asking me to risk. It was not an attack, but it was a shield. And the silence that followed told me the message had landed harder than any speech ever could, because deep down they all knew the truth. They wanted me to lie so they would not have to face what he had done. The fallout came quickly after that, because once you refuse to play the role assigned to you, the whole script collapses, and my brother's desperation shifted into anger as he tried to smear me in conversations with relatives, telling them I had been part of his reporting team, and that if he was guilty then I must be guilty too. But every time he said it, the evidence contradicted him, and every log that was pulled from the system showed the same thing. He had been alone in manipulating the data, and I had left nothing but clean, verifiable work in my wake, so the more he tried to drag me down, the more obvious his isolation became. Until even the cousins who used to roll their eyes at me were texting quietly to ask whether I was doing all right. When the suspension email finally landed in his inbox and his access card stopped working, he called me one last time, his voice cracking not with sorrow but with fury, and repeated his threat that I would regret this. That without his version of events I would be nothing, and I listened in silence until he finished, and then I said, as calmly as I could, that I had no interest in his version anymore. Because for the first time in my life the truth was speaking louder than his stories, and I did not need to raise my voice. I only needed to step back and let the system do what it was built to do. And as I hung up the phone, I felt the quiet power of that choice settle over me, because I realized that revenge does not always arrive in the form of a dramatic takedown or a clever trap. Sometimes it looks like refusing to sign your name on a lie, refusing to be the safety net that lets someone else keep pretending, and letting the consequences they created finally catch them without cushioning the fall. The thing about people like my brother is that they never collapse quietly, because even when the evidence is stacked so high it casts a shadow over the entire room, they still believe that with enough charm, spin, or sheer volume, they can convince the world that gravity does not apply to them. And in the days that followed his suspension, he did exactly what I knew he would do, which was launch into a campaign of narrative control that played out like a politician's press tour, with a carefully worded social media post about clerical misunderstandings, jealous saboteurs, and how sometimes numbers do not tell the whole story, followed by a string of comments from sympathetic acquaintances who wanted to believe the myth of his brilliance, because it was easier than acknowledging that they had been applauding smoke and mirrors for years. My mother shared the post across every platform she had access to, adding her own captions about resilience and unfair attacks, while my father simply liked the post without comment, a move that told me he was trying, in his quiet way, not to inflame either side, but the damage was already in motion, because in the court of public opinion the first version of the story always has an edge, and my brother was determined to frame himself as the wronged man brought down by envy. In the past I would have engaged, maybe not directly but through subtle corrections, clarifying remarks, or whispered reassurances to people who asked me privately if what they had heard was true. Because I used to think that defending the truth required constant vigilance, yet this time I did something different, something that felt almost radical for me, which was to remain completely silent in the online spaces where he was staging his defense. And instead I put my energy into something cleaner and far more effective. I wrote a short article on attribution in sales and why companies so often miscount renewals as new business, a piece that avoided names, accusations, or family drama, and focused purely on process integrity and the way organizations unintentionally incentivize people to inflate numbers. It was neutral in tone, professional in presentation, and entirely factual, and because of that it landed harder than any emotional rebuttal could have, earning quiet respect from people inside the industry, including some of Victor's colleagues who reached out to say they appreciated the clarity. Without saying a single word about my brother, I had starved his spin of oxygen by shifting the spotlight to the very system he had abused. At home, though, the pressure mounted. My mother called almost daily to insist that if I truly cared about the family's reputation, I would agree to appear in a unity photo, some carefully staged image of all of us smiling around a table as though nothing had happened. The kind of visual she believed could erase weeks of headlines and whisper campaigns. I told her no, not angrily but firmly, and the silence on the other end of the line was heavy enough to tell me she understood the refusal meant more than just skipping a picture. It meant I was no longer willing to launder the truth with my own face. For years, those photos had been the currency of our family myth, proof to outsiders that we were close, harmonious, and proud of each other, and by declining to participate, I had broken the facade in a way more powerful than any public accusation, because absence in those images spoke louder than a smile ever could. Meanwhile, I took another step that surprised even me. I agreed to host a short internal webinar for Victor's company on audit trails and attribution accuracy, framed not as a scandal response, but as an educational session designed to strengthen processes for the future. It was clinical, concise, and built entirely on the kind of workflow recommendations I had been making for years. Yet its impact reached further than I imagined, because by teaching the system that had enabled my brother's manipulations, I effectively cut off the loopholes he had exploited and ensured that no one else could replicate his tactics without being caught. The beauty of that move was that it looked altruistic on the surface, a contribution to better governance, yet beneath it carried the sharp edge of revenge, because it erased the tricks he relied on and turned his supposed genius into nothing more than a case study in why stronger controls were needed. The night before the webinar, Victor messaged me privately to say the board wanted me present at the upcoming review, not just as a consultant, but as a voice they could trust to explain the systemic issues in a way that cut through the noise. It was the kind of invitation that confirmed my credibility had only grown while my brother shrank, and yet it also carried a weight I could feel in my chest, because I knew that stepping into that room would not just be a professional act. It would be a declaration that I had chosen the truth over family loyalty once and for all. My mother must have sensed it too, because she called immediately after, her voice sharp with panic rather than pleading this time, and told me that if I dared to sit in that review I would be dead to her. That no child of hers could possibly humiliate their own brother like that, even if he had done everything they said he had done. I held the phone to my ear, listening to her rage spill out like a dam breaking, and I felt the familiar ache of knowing that in her eyes I was never the daughter who achieved quietly and honestly. I was the liability who risked upsetting the story she had built around her son. Yet instead of arguing, I simply stayed silent until she finished, because I knew there was nothing I could say that would change her allegiance, and when the line went quiet I set the phone down, not in anger but in certainty, because I had already made my choice. The next morning, as I prepared my notes and logged into the webinar, I felt the weight of that choice settle into something solid. I was no longer the fixer, the understudy, or the silent one in the background cleaning up after him. I was the person holding the mic, not to expose him with malice, but to dismantle the machinery that had allowed him to thrive unchecked, and that was its own form of justice. And while my mother might never forgive me, and while my brother would surely twist the story until his last breath, I knew the truth was now louder than their spin, and the board's request was proof that the world outside my family finally saw me for who I really was, not as the shadow of someone else's myth, but as the voice that ended it. The board review was scheduled in a room that carried the kind of silence you feel in your bones before anyone even speaks, the kind of silence that announces that this is not about feelings or appearances, but about facts, evidence, and decisions that will shape reputations for years. And as I sat there at the long table beside Victor, watching my brother shift in his chair with the restless energy of someone who still believed a clever excuse could rewrite a trail of digital breadcrumbs, I realized that this was the first time in my life where I was not positioned as the buffer between him and the consequences of his own actions. The evidence came out piece by piece, not dramatic, not theatrical, just a steady cascade of logs, timestamps, and records that showed in painstaking detail how he had inflated renewals into new sales. padded credentials on forms that were supposed to be checked against a certification database, and rerouted referral bonuses into his own pipeline. It was not a character assassination, it was not personal commentary, it was mathematics, metadata, and undeniable discrepancies, and there was a strange sort of relief in knowing that I did not have to raise my voice or argue my case, because the system itself was speaking louder than I ever could. As the board laid out the consequences, termination for cause, repayment schedules for bonuses improperly taken, and mandatory training across the entire sales division based on the compliance workflow I had written, I felt an odd mixture of grief and liberation, because watching my brother unravel in front of strangers should have been painful, but instead it felt like witnessing a long-delayed equilibrium, a correction that had been waiting to happen since childhood, when every broken rule of his became my responsibility to conceal. My mother sat rigid in the back of the room, refusing to look at me, her loyalty carved so deeply into her that she would rather pretend the evidence was fabricated than admit her golden son had built his castle on sand. And in that moment I knew that no matter how cleanly the facts were presented, I would never be forgiven for refusing to bend them. When it was my turn to speak, I finally shared the news I had been holding back for weeks, the piece of my life my mother told me to hide so my brother could shine, and I said, clearly and without hesitation, that I had turned down a flashier offer months earlier because I had chosen instead to accept a compliance leadership role where integrity mattered more than theatrics, and that this choice was the single most important act of self-preservation I had ever made. I explained that I would no longer be the quiet emergency contact who patched over disasters at midnight, that I would no longer answer texts that said, "Fix this before morning," and that I was moving into a new place where I could finally live without the constant weight of being both invisible and indispensable. It was not a triumphant speech, it was not about humiliating anyone, it was simply the truth of a woman who had decided that enough was enough. The final act of revenge, though, was not loud or vengeful in the way some might expect. It was precise, deliberate, and clean. I negotiated with Victor and the board to create an ethics scholarship in the Hayes family name, awarded not to insiders or relatives, but to candidates with no connections at all, a scholarship that would exist as a reminder that the Hayes name, once used as a shield for arrogance, was now tied to accountability and fairness. It was not about erasing my brother, it was about redirecting the legacy, turning what had been a weapon of favoritism into a tool for transparency, and though I never said it out loud, I knew this would sting him more than any insult, because it stripped the myth of its last layer and rebuilt it into something he could not control. When we left the building that day, my mother cornered me with eyes full of anger and desperation, demanding to know whether I would at least like my brother's public apology post, a carefully worded statement about misunderstandings, lessons learned, and moving forward, the kind of empty PR gesture that fools only those who need to be fooled. I told her no, softly but firmly, and I added that I was done proving I was good by cleaning up after him, done lending my credibility to a story that had never been mine, and then I set my house key on the kitchen table without another word. There was no dramatic exit, no yelling, just the quiet sound of a door closing behind me, and with it the role I had been forced to play for decades. Weeks later, as I unpacked boxes in my new apartment, the kind of place where no one else's demands could intrude on my silence, my inbox pinged with a message from someone I did not know. A woman who wrote that she had nearly signed a financial note to cover her brother's debts, but stopped when she saw my article on signatures and accountability, and she thanked me for reminding her that protecting yourself does not mean betraying your family. It means refusing to betray yourself. I read her words twice, and for the first time in years I felt something close to peace, because I realized that I had not only stepped out of the shadow my family built around my brother, I had also left behind a map for anyone else who had been told to shrink so someone else could shine. In the end, I did not win a family back, I did not heal the fractures, and I did not earn my mother's approval, but I won something more important. I won myself, my integrity, my right to be seen on my own terms, and my refusal to let someone else's lies define me. And while my brother will spend years spinning stories to anyone who will listen, I no longer need to counter them, because the truth has already been spoken, and the final move has already been made.